The long march to the institutions is the skeleton key for understanding the modern left. It's how they captured power, how they shape the narrative, and how they influence what you think about the world around you. The story of the Long March to the Institutions begins in the early 1970s. At this point, the left-wing radical movements in Europe and the United States had hit a wall. They really believed, starting in about 1968, that they could overthrow Western capitalist democracies through violent Marxist-Leninist revolution. They attempted assassinations, building takeovers. They tried to foment urban guerrilla warfare in the United States in places like Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco. But this did nothing to spark a broader revolution, and in fact, it backfired completely. It alienated the public, including really the entirety of the working and poor classes in the United States, who recoiled at the violence and really solidified their support for that American dream, middle-class lifestyle that after World War II had become widely available to millions of Americans. And so the left-wing intellectuals of the era had to reformulate. They were looking at, for example, the landslide re-election of Richard Nixon in '72 with a sense of immense despair. How could this happen? How could our revolution have failed? What can we do to salvage our Marxist-Leninist ideology from the ashes? And a really important figure in this is a German student radical named Rudi Dutschke. Rudi Dutschke was really a brilliant student activist in Germany, also had connections all over Europe and the United States. And he was kind of the key strategist for this youthful revolt centered around college campuses. And he saw very clearly that the student attempts, these are, smart children of the upper class attending university, steeped in left-wing ideology, approaching it from an intellectual vantage point. He realized that the outreach that he and others had been doing to, let's say, factory workers or industrial workers or low-level wage workers was hitting a barrier. It was very difficult for them to really implement what they thought of as the traditional Marxist alliance between the vanguard of the proletariat, a kind of euphemism for the revolutionaries of the upper classes, with the masses of the poor and working classes. This was also a dead end for many reasons, including that the masses were uninterested in revolution. And so Dutschke formulated a strategy that he talked about in a long correspondence via letter with the German-American philosopher Herbert Marcuse, the godfather of the New Left, the real intellectual heavyweight of the movement in the 1960s. And he formulated this idea of the long march to the institutions. They had acknowledged that the working class revolution had failed, and they had said, what we really need to do is take our core group of people, our cadre of the smartest left-wing intellectuals based in the universities, predominantly people under the age of 30, and start infiltrating the elite institutions that shape knowledge and culture. They talked about how to gain entry into universities, into education, into media, into other aspects of those key institutions that form the background knowledge of how everyday people think, the ones that formulate the language that most people use, the concepts that people apply to their daily experience in order to make decisions. And this is really a kind of tacit admission that the student radicals were in some sense useless. They had no ability to, say, take over an automobile manufacturing plant and then run the production on behalf of the proletariat. College-educated people at the Ivy Leagues or at elite German universities really had no capacity to manage the industrial economy. And so what they did quite brilliantly was shift from the attempt to seize the means of industrial production to an attempt to seize the means of cultural production or knowledge production. They wanted to then, in essence, seize the bureaucratic institutions that weren't directly involved in productive capacity, but were directly involved in managing all of the perceptions and symbols and narratives and human resources and legal concepts. And so they thought that by managing the structure of knowledge within existing institutions, they could take power. This is also, again, a tacit admission that they were really at a dead end in trying to create their own institutions. Marxist, Leninist revolutionaries are good at some things. One thing they're not good at is starting viable and self-sufficient organizations. They're really always infighting. They're always splitting into factions. They're always collapsing because of mismanagement. You see this throughout the 1960s. And so again, adapting to their own weaknesses, Duchka quite brilliantly said, we're going for knowledge production, and we're going to try to infiltrate, take over, and influence from within existing institutions that have already built up capacity, that have already built up reputation, that have already built up channels for the distribution of knowledge. And so in summary, the Long March to the Institutions is not a revolution of the working class. It's an elite revolution. It's not a bottom-up social process. It's the imposition of revolutionary ideas from the top down. Once the Long March to the Institutions began, it started the arc of 50 years of the transition from radicalism to bureaucracy. And this is the essential component of the historical development of left-wing ideology in our time. You can take it really by example. If you look at, for example, the 1974 publication Prairie Fire, written by members of the Weather Underground, a revolutionary terror organization, you can see all of the tropes, all of the ideas, and all of the concepts starting to really come to the surface in written form. You have to remember that the Weather Underground was truly an underground organization. They had members of this decentralized network in hiding in places like New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, all of these coastal corridors where they could really operate under the surface, out of the eye of the FBI, out of the eye of local law enforcement. And they truly believed that violent revolution against the United States was imminent. They believed that it could be achieved. And once this idea slowly started to descend, it started to collapse for people, they started to shift their strategy. And the publication of Prairie Fire really is a key document in the development of this idea. I've actually held in my hands one of the original copies, the original first edition prints of this little booklet with the plastic jacket. It's a remarkable artifact. And so what you get, if you look back at this document, is all of the tropes associated with left-wing ideology that's dominant today. You get the ideas like systemic racism and white privilege and post-colonialism. You get this tremendous sense of elite white guilt that then is extended to an almost paternalistic interest in revolution on behalf of the third world, on behalf of the oppressed minority classes in the United States. And even though the language shifts over time, all of the key ideas are there already in 1974. But this wasn't an academic journal. This wasn't on the front page of the New York Times. This was published in secret. The authors were in hiding. Many of the authors were actually wanted by the FBI, and they had to distribute it through kind of radical left-wing publishing houses, through coffee shops, through university towns, through the alternative means of ideological production of the time. And then if you fast forward to, say, 50 years later, the 2020s, after the death of George Floyd, is a really remarkable period illustrating this shift. The ideas, the core concepts of Prairie Fire are now embedded in the federal government, in our healthcare system, in almost every department of the university system, and in K through 12 pedagogy. I've spent the last 2 years reviewing documents, reviewing diversity trainings, K through 12 curricula, PowerPoint presentations, and other matters of ideological production from within our most prestigious institutions, publicly funded universities, elite government agencies like the Department of the Treasury, and all of the largest K through 12 school districts around the country. And it really dawned on me, if you hold them up in comparison, Prairie Fire and, let's say, a Department of the Treasury training in 2020 on systemic racism, these are the same things. They're promoting the same narrative. They're using the same language. And it's really remarkable, the trajectory of this has gone from the margins to the center. It's gone from something that had to be published in secret and in hiding to something that's being promoted at the highest levels of the bureaucracy in all of our knowledge-making institutions. Not just universities, where I think it's become common knowledge since the 1990s that these ideas were percolating. Even many of the people in the Weather Underground managed to get university positions after they came out of hiding. They managed to work in public school bureaucracies in places like Chicago and have influence over the curriculum. But also corporations. This is kind of maybe the most brilliant and sophisticated and frankly impressive intellectual coup. They moved an anti-capitalist ideology into the C-suite of the Fortune 100 companies. And one of the key figures here again is a colleague of Duchka, I believe the third wife of Marcuse, a woman named Ricky Marcuse, who took these ideas, these radical ideas, gave them a veneer of management language, and then started the trend in the 1970s of so-called anti-racism workshops in corporations, in businesses. And so what do you have after this long march to the institutions? You've gone from radicalism to bureaucracy. You've gone from margin to center. You've gone from something that was perceived of as fringe to something that is really perceived of as the common language or the common culture. And so you have this incredible movement. What I think is ultimately the triumph of the Long March through the institutions as an effective strategy for promoting ideas. You've taken that core set of ideas from people like Herbert Marcuse and Rudi Dutschke and the Weather Underground, and now they've moved from radicalism to bureaucracy. They've moved from counterculture to establishment. And once you understand this, once you can really unlock that, all of the things you might be seeing around you, whether it's in your workplace, whether it's in your kid's school, some of the documents that come home in your child's backpack, or whether it's in all of the seemingly pervasive buzzwords that you hear, that you're not quite sure where they come from, but suddenly you're seeing them perpetuated and promoted through all of the knowledge-making institutions. It's really a feeling that they're being imposed on you from the top down. Once you understand how they got there, how they secured transmission, a lot of things that are happening in our culture become clear. So if you take for granted that the long march to the institutions has been somewhat completed, it's achieved its objective, at least to a certain extent, what you really have to do is then take a survey of all of the institutions that have power and influence in the United States today. And I think one of the best ways to do this, to get to really the heart of what's happening in our country today, is to look at our institutions as a kind of economy of ideological production. What ideas get created? What ideas get distributed? What ideas get transmitted and have influence within institutions, within education, within people's day-to-day life? Because the key theory that underpins the Long March to the institutions is that if you can shape the overall ideological environment of a society, you can subtly shift behavior to achieve your deeper ideological goals. And so while I don't think most people in our institutions today that are promoting these ideas are committed to Marxist-Leninist revolution, like the people like Rudi Dutschke or Marcuse or the radicals of the Weather Underground 50 years ago, they still share some of the same residual or the same residues of those ideas today. This is anti-capitalism. This is abolishing the police, abolishing prisons. This is reshaping the United States Constitution away from the idea of colorblind equality towards the principle of group identity-based rights. A society that should be really leveled and fundamentally shifted along the axes of class, but most particularly on the axes of race and sex. And so when you look at how ideas get produced, you can start to think about what are those most important means of transmission. These were identified directly by Rudi Dutschke as he was formulating this strategy. So when you think of the universities, these are overwhelmingly left-wing ideological environments. You had a survey of professors done a number of years ago that showed that in the social sciences, for example, about a quarter of professors self-identify as Marxist. Many more identify as kind of on the radical side of left-wing politics. Or you look even at the most prestigious institutions, something like Harvard, where I believe 98 or 99% of the professors are left of center. You have almost no conservative professors in the institution today. And so you see how that matters, because the ideas that get generated in the university then start to trickle down through other institutions. They become, for example, K through 12 pedagogy through graduate schools of education, where Paulo Freire and critical race theory are really the key ideas that are being transmitted to the next generation of public school teachers in our public university systems that train and sanction and credential teachers before they go into the classroom. But you also have in the legal academy, in human resources departments, you have these new theories of expertise on anti-discrimination law, on affirmative action law, that move from the legal academy to the judicial opinions to policy in HR departments across corporations. So you see those ideas also getting transmitted there. And then when you get to K through 12 education, which I think is really the most important place, you see the saturation of these ideas. And I think if you look at it from a teacher's perspective, for example, you can get a sense of how ideological production has become extremely lopsided, reflecting the dominance of this strategy, the achievement of the Long March. If you're a K through 12 teacher and you're looking for a lesson plan on the history of racism or racial injustice in the United States, which is undoubtedly an important component of history, something that should be tackled with a balanced view with the utmost seriousness. If you're Googling around or looking on Pinterest or trying to find some material or lesson plans or models, which is what many teachers do, they actually tell researchers how they discover their lesson plans. If you're looking for lesson plans, you're going to discover an environment where 95% plus of these lesson plans are left-leaning or maybe very left-leaning. And so simply by the creation of quantity, by not the quality of the ideas, but the quantity of these ideas, the production of these ideas, they gain distribution. And you can think of this in terms of classical economics. You have essentially ideological cartels in many of our institutions, where there is a set of ideas that are permitted and a set of ideas that are produced in mass, so that the consumer or the demand side is really picking from a very limited range of ideas that are already organized within the means of knowledge production to have a dominant position downstream. You have, of course, dissenting ideas. You have Hillsdale College. You have the National Association of Scholars. You have conservative think tanks and nonprofits. But if you compare them as a total percentage of the supply of ideological material in our country today, it is sub 10%. It's a very small fraction. If you look at all of the public institutions, all of the K through 12 bureaucracies, all of the DEI departments across all levels of our institutional life, these are left-wing dominant. And you can even test this very simply. You can say, well, in the workplace, is it permitted or encouraged or even mandated, say, to talk about or support the BLM movement? Or is it mandated or permitted to, say, talk about or support the pro-life movement? The result of this is a massive ideological imbalance that is subsidized in many cases by state institutions, that results in a kind of ideological cartel that is fundamentally reshaping how we think, how we feel, and how we act in public and private life. Where does this story of the Long March to the Institutions go from here? I think that we're at this critical point where the Long March to the Institutions has reached a terminus, has reached an endpoint, has reached a position of dominance. And then all of a sudden, the dynamics shift. It's not that these are outsider ideas or countercultural ideas or subversive ideas. These are the ideas of the institutions, of the establishment, of the dominant position. The problem is that they don't have the intellectual sustenance or heft in order to be stable governing ideologies. This is the reason that so many left-wing organizations are always riven with infighting, riven with internal problems, riven with contradiction. The ideology starts to devour itself because it was never designed as a governing philosophy. It was never designed to be running General Motors or the Treasury Department or the education of 600,000 kids in the Los Angeles public school system. So what we're seeing is a limit to the ideology of transgression. We're seeing a contradiction of the philosophy of negation. And there's an opportunity here for conservatives because this dissolving power of the left-wing ideology that has now marched through the institutions is starting to raise fundamental questions. You're hearing in our debates, in our discourse, questions like, what is a woman? What is the purpose of families? Is the United States good? How should we treat one another fundamentally? And this provides, in some sense, a evidence of the success of these ideas. Questions that maybe shouldn't have to be asked because they're axiomatic, because everyone knows the basic function of a family, because most people agree that the United States is a force for good. But this is also an opportunity because it's challenging conservatives, it's challenging people who oppose this left-wing orthodoxy to start digging deeper and to start coming up with answers to these questions. And so we've arrived at the emergence of the fundamental. And this provides us with an opportunity to start creating these ideas. And there are really two steps that we need to go through in order to push back and in order to stop the forward momentum of the Long March. The first is intellectual. We actually have to create the answers to those questions. We need to answer the question of what is a man? What is a woman? What is the purpose of a family? We need to launch an intellectual defense of the normative values of the common citizen, the middle American who feels besieged by these ideas. We need to actually say why the American middle class is a force for good. It's worth protecting and it's worth expanding. And most fundamentally, we need to answer the question why the United States is a good country, why it's based on a system of ideas and principles and laws that are fundamentally a force for good. But once we've answered those questions, there's a second crucial step. We need to not content ourselves with having the better ideas, the better argument, the better defense. We need to actually have the mechanisms of ideological production and transmission so that those ideas can compete, not just in the realm of pure abstraction and pure intellect, but in the realm of achieving dominance or achieving at least some sense of balance within our institutions. So we should have the Treasury Department, rather than teaching that the United States is systemically racist, teaching at a bare minimum that the United States is actually a force for good, or at a maximum, having those be the fundamental guiding principles of our governing institutions. And then you could go on down the line from government to universities to K-12 education to corporate HR and corporate culture. We need to start competing in those spheres. We need to increase conservative ideological production to at least parity with left-wing ideological production. So that when a public school teacher is designing a curriculum on American history for a 5th grade class, they can search on Google, they can look at different curricula or pedagogies or textbooks that are available and find at least options so that they can compare and contrast. Well, is the Howard Zinn Project, a very left-wing content provider for schools, they can compare it against a Hillsdale curriculum. They can say, well, which one is better? Which one reflects the values of the families that I am serving in my institution? Which one is a more accurate, honest, and productive reading of American history? So we have a system where the ideologies or the ideas or the concepts or even the very language, the words that we use, are not just dominated by the movements of the Long March, but they're now contested. And that we create enough production so that we create options. We can actually have supply and demand in the ideological sphere starting to compete again. Because I'm convinced, and the public polling data says this over and over and over, that the common citizen of all racial backgrounds, of all economic backgrounds, the common family in this country wants something different that they're getting forced onto them from the top down by these institutions. But in order to make that a possibility, we don't have to just win the argument. We don't have to just represent the large majority of the American people. We have to go out and roll up our sleeves and fight to create, to produce, and distribute those ideas that are ultimately going to win.